Hey folks, it's Ardwulf. Welcome to part 2 of our overview of HarnMaster religion. If you have not yet watched part 1, I strongly recommend that you go do so, because there's going to be a lot of contextual stuff that I do not explain in this video. It is instead explained in the other one. So let's take a look, pick up exactly where we left off with the Church of Lorani. Okay, so as mentioned in part 1, Lorani is the Lady of Paladins. She is a god of war, but she is also a god of chivalry and honor and staying in your lane. Here in the article, which is one of the longer articles in the book, we have histories of the early church, a lot of which takes place off Harn itself. We have St. Peroline, who is a historical figure of the Loranian church, some of the divine servants, Mendiz the lion, for example, which is a demi-divine servant of Lorani, for example. And there's some other ones here as well. So a lot of cool detail here. There are a number of clerical and fighting orders, as is the case with the Church of Agric. Lorani is a god of war. So there are clerical orders who are clerics and fighting orders which are dedicated to Lorani, not less so than the clerical orders necessarily, and who are basically knights, although they may or may not actually have that like political standing of knights, but they're in terms of training, they're knights that serve one of these fighting orders. So the clerical orders include the Order of the Spear of Shattered Sorrow, which is active on the east side of Harn. They are engaged in some atrocities on that side of the island and are doing some dirty business that perhaps the Lady of Paladins shouldn't approve of. To what extent that is a problem is a plot hook, so I would encourage you to investigate that. And then the Order of Hivrik, which is the Loranian clerical order that is active on the western side of the island, so in Rithim and Candé and the Thardic Republic. And this order is tied up with the whole history of the Order of the Copper Hook, the Agrican fighting order, and the Order of the Checkered Shield, the rival Loranian fighting order, that themselves started squabbling, and that turned into a big war between Candé and Rithim in the relatively recent past. It does talk about corruption in the church and how we should maybe deal with that. Then we get right into the organization of the church. And again, we have a lengthy sidebar here about what Loranians think of the other deities. So Agric, for example, the great rival of Lorani, enjoys pestilence, suffering, and wanton destruction, as do all vermin who pledge themselves to him. Where we are reluctant warriors, Agricans delight in war and savagery. Only we can prevent them and their vile god of war from undoing the world. Now, it seems unfair to not give the Agricans equal time, so let's take a look at what the Agricans think about Lorani. Lorani, the bitch of Dolithor, antagonizes our warlord at every turn. Her chivalry is an attempt to subvert the natural order. Her followers must be fought at every opportunity by whatever means necessary. Our warlord rejoices when her servants are put to death, but rejoices even more when they are persuaded by any means to renounce her and acknowledge him instead. So, an evil church, like we said. Okay, so now we have more stuff about the structure of the church, the chivalric code and how that works. This is very much structured to be a good church, but that doesn't necessarily mean that people in the good church aren't doing bad stuff in various places, as we talked about. Here is, again, the hierarchy of an individual temple. There's a thing about Loranian funerals. Here's the sort of metaphysical thing that Loranians believe when about the creation of the world, which is a little bit different from the one in the beginning of the book. And then here we have the Loranian invocations. Now, there's more of these, I think, mostly because Lorani tends to be one of the more popular deities for player characters. Agric does too. So, and, even if you have Agrican characters, what do you have as opposing them? You probably need some Loranians as well. And so we have a page and a half of those. Now we come to a new one that we haven't talked about. This is Morgoth. Now, those of you many of you might recognize the similarity of the name to Morgoth, the big bad evil guy in the Silmarillion. I am sure that the similarity, although it is slightly different, is not a coincidence here. Morgoth here is, and I might say Morgoth, so we get that out of the way. Morgoth here is a deity of chaos and undeath. He represents chaos. So his titles include the Tormentor of the Unlamented Dead, the Wielder of the Shadow of Incarnate Evil, and the Master of Chaos. And you would think, hey, this is probably a deity that is basically banned everywhere. And you'd mostly be right, except that there are places where it is legal to be a follower of Morgoth, and places off of Harn in which the Temple of Morgoth, and actually even one place on Harn, the city of Golotha, is largely the most powerful force in Golotha is the Church of Morgoth. And in the Azoriani Empire, actually, the Church of Morgoth is very powerful. There are reasons why that's the case, and it's not as simple as there's evil people here. There are like historical built into the history reasons why the Church of Morgoth arose in the first place in the part of Harn where it is a thing, and why it still hangs on to power in some places. And we get to talking about a lot of that history here. Including some of the divine teachings. Here is the Morgothian prayer. Now, the Morgothian promise is that if you are a good servant of Morgoth, you will get to endure forever as an undead. In practice, there's a couple different kinds of undead in Harn. That's almost worth its own video, to be honest about it, because that's actually fairly complicated. But there's basically like mindless undead, like your typical skeleton and zombie undead, and your free-willed undead, the sort of higher form of undead. And if you're a yokel, you're presumably going to be reanimated as a zombie, whereas if you're a really good follower of Morgoth, you might get reanimated as a free-willed undead. Here's Morgoth's opinion, or Morgoth's church's opinion of the other deities. Here's more on the organization of the church. Again, this is something that we see in every one of these. It's good to have this information to place a clerical character, even if it's an NPC, in the context of, okay, so you're a church, you're a priest of Lorani. What is your like actual temple rank? So who is going to come to you and tell you, I need you to go do this thing, for example? Here are the 13 articles. These are one of the Morgothian orders, I think. Again, temple hierarchy. Here's the various positions within the temple. So the Shadow of Bukrai is this sort of shadow power that is wielded by Morgoth. And it is what animates the undead. And you get a little bit of mechanics that deal with this. You have these Bukrai points. And here's actually the definition of the undead is the Amorvin, the free-willed undead, and the Gulmorvin, the mindless dead, and a servant of Morgoth, Cleiss, the necromancer, for example. More on the Shadow of Bukrai. This is an interesting, like, sort of, it gets its own mechanic, where typically these things in these don't normally get their own mechanics. The system is not that detailed that it has a mechanic for everything. The Shadow of Bukrai gets a mechanic. And then we have a relatively short list of priestly invocations. Next is Navi. Navi is the Lord of the Pitch Shadows, the Lord of the Last Illusion, Wealth's Worry, and the Merchant of Death. This is essentially the god of secrets and assassins. The church, the actual temples of Navi are basically, they're not illegal everywhere. They're illegal in most places. Even places that tolerate Agric and Morgoth. But even when they are legal, they are still hidden. In terms of number of adherents, Navi is probably the least popular deity with the possible exception of Siem, which we'll get to in this video, by the way. There will not be a part 3, I'll mention. So, and again, another evil god, very easily villainized god, but there's some really interesting details here. So like, Dejekis, the cursed cat who was the favorite of Halia and was basically kidnapped and tortured by Navi. There are the Getevsha that are the invisible demonic servants and minions of Navi. There is a big process to join the temple. You can't just join the temple of Navi, right? You have to go through these trials to do so. And many of those temples will contain this elaborate labyrinth filled with traps and stuff that you have to navigate. Here's the Navian opinions of the other gods. Navi obviously has a negative opinion of absolutely everybody. Here's a thing that you can include in any campaign: wandering rural worshippers of Navi, the night people. This is something that's like not, I don't remember seeing any discussion of these at any point elsewhere, but this is something you can literally drop in wherever. Here's the thing about Navian funerals. This is interesting, right? Because Navi is in some sense a god of death. He's a god of death arriving ahead of schedule, if you will. So how do they look at that? Well, we have a description of Navian funerals here. And then here are the Navian invocations. Next is Peony. Peony is the mother goddess, the goddess of agriculture and plenty and healing. She is probably, in some sense, including the modern sense, the most good temple. She is also the patron of peasants, so and is the fertility goddess as well. So she is obviously very popular among the lower classes everywhere. There are some places, including on Harn itself, where the Church of Peony is illegal, but it's often looked the other way because Peony is another one of those temples that encourages people, if you are lowborn, to not get too uppity and stay in your place. We have the definite description of earth and fertility cults here. This is like a typical member of the female order of the Balm of Joy. So unlike all the other orders that I can think of off the top of my head, the Peonian order, there are two clerical orders of Peony, one male and one female. So it's all men in one order and all female in the other order. Other orders, other clerical and fighting orders on Harn are not like that, but there is the Order of the Crimson Dancer, which is an Agrican order, which is all female, that I hadn't thought of when we were talking about Agric. And I think they were basically run out of Harn and went up to Ivinia. So as you can imagine, the Peonian traditions include a lot about the harvest, so this article is going to talk about the relationship of that to Peony. Peony's coterie of divine servants is presented as a family. Peony is the goddess of the family. Religious practices. There's a Peonian prophet here. There are various rituals that are described, and again, that's always cool for color. It's like, okay, you have to interrupt this this, or whoever, everybody gets these rituals. You have to interrupt this ritual. Here's what's going on, right? Peonian opinions of the other deities. So the Church of Peony and the Church of Lorani are relatively closely linked. They get along pretty much everywhere where they both exist. And in those places, the Church of Peony tends to be the church of the lowborn people, and the Church of Lorani tends to be the church of the highborn people. And if there's anybody else and any other deities involved, that tends to be the Church of Halia, who tends to be the church of the merchant classes. More so like pure merchants who are traders rather than crafters, like blacksmiths and wheelwrights and stuff like that. So that's kind of the typical structure. There are places on Harn, including the Thardic Republic too, actually, and Rathim, where that's very much inverted, where the church of the peasantry is often Peony, but sometimes it's Morgoth, and the church of the nobility is often Agric, but sometimes it's Navi or Morgoth, or everybody else is pretty much banned from Rathim, I believe. So the evil places on the island intentionally sort of break that divine relationship to the social structure. All right, so structure of the Peonian church. Here is a list of the Peonian invocations. And now we are on to Cerien, who is the Reaver god. This is the third of the Harnic war gods. Cerien is a war god, but he's also kind of the head of his own interesting pantheon of related deities. He is the god of the Ivinians. He is not a native to Harn. He appears to really exist and be worshipped only by Ivinian. So Cerien is very much the Odin figure of the Ivinians. We've got some interesting information about the early church, including the Saga of Biari Threehand, which is an old Ivinian myth. Religious practices. being a cleric of Cerien is typically a function that is held by a specific clan. And in fact, many of the clans are in fact like trade clans, performing some of the functions that you would expect that guilds would perform. Cerienian funerals. Here's Cerien's opinion of the other deities. Central authority. Central authority, pretty much, there isn't one, but the religion is clearly centered in Ivinia. Here's the Praedalkiri, which are the sort of demi-divine servants, sometimes rivals, sometimes offspring of Cerien. And there's three big ones that are mentioned under Cerien: Usnal, the Lord of Bears; Niehu, the Lord of Whales; and Yarlak, the Carrion Lord. But there's also like at least one or two living on Harn that you can like go visit, literally. So that's another thing, is that you have these sort of demigod figures living on Harn, in sort of contravention of the normal expectation for Harn to be relatively low magic, which again is true, sort of, but sort of it's not. Here is Harkor Thorin, who was an individual that's existed several centuries ago. Here are the Elkiri, which are, think Valkyries here. These are the female handmaidens of Cerien who encourage warriors to be valorous, for example, and they are dead shield maidens. Here is like a sort of poem to Skival the Mariner. And then here's the Cerienian invocations. Next is Savekanoor, who is the god of knowledge and of secrets. He is the sage of the gods, the keeper of the Varhivrak, the tome, the illimitable tome that contains all knowledge. This is the concordat of the illimitable tome, concluded to stave off the chaos that came from the unfettered actions of the gods and the unbridled sharing of lore. So the notional thing here is that Savekanoor is in favor of keeping knowledge secret. Because people who have misused secrets in the past caused chaos, and that's like part of the mythology. So next we have a description of the early church. There are three orders that worship Savekanoor, and they are sort of ranked in order of like seniority or rank. The Hin Ilori, for example, is the largest and the lowest of the three orders. The Shea Al Akor is the highest and smallest of the orders. And you can, again, you take that as a plot point as well. We have, again, organization of the temples and your opinions of the other deities and the individual ranks within the temple. Savekanoor is a relatively popular choice for player characters who are scholars or mages or something like that. And then here's the invocations. And then we have Siem, who is the sort of hardest god to put a finger on, actually, even harder than Ilver. He is the god of the elves and dwarves, for example. He is the lord of dreams. It says here that he is king of the uttermost west. You can take that as a Tolkien reference as well. The lord of the azure bowl. The bowl is connected with the making, holding, and the spilling forth of the stars. So Siem is the god of astronomy and the stars as well. Again, pretty hard to keep a finger on this, and it's very easy to kind of fit this into the religion of the Sindarin, who are the elves of Harn. A little harder to do with the Kuzdul, who are the dwarves. Once you sort of separate the idea that they have to worship him in the same way between the two peoples, then it starts to make more sense. The dwarves are going to, in my imagining, are going to do a lot more with reverence toward the ancestors and things like that than the Sindarin are going to. Because in a lot of cases, to the Sindarin, who are immortal after all, the ancestors are still around in some cases. Not in every case, because they can be killed, but it does happen. So next we have the human worshippers of Siem, which is a thing. A bunch of the humans that live in Azadmir, for example, as subjects of the king of Azadmir, are in fact worshippers of Siem. And then there's some semi-divine servants of Siem. For example, the Blessed Realm. This is the uttermost west that elves depart to when they tire of the mortal world. Yes, that is also a thing in Harn. This is never actually stated, but it is presented in such a way that you are free to draw the conclusion that the elves and dwarves of Harn are, in fact, the elves and dwarves of Middle-earth. Thus, the Blessed Realm Realm, Harn is a place that they stopped at on their way to the Blessed Realm, for example. And that's, not 100% in line with Tolkien's cosmology, but it's fairly easy to fit it in, and it's fairly easy to treat the world of Midgod, which is another of the worlds in the sort of family that Thera, the world of Harn, is in. We should do a video on this. It's very easy to treat that as Middle-earth. And then here we have the Invocations of CM. And then we have an index, which is interesting. And I think probably the list of invocations is useful. The index is probably not that useful because of the organization of the whole thing into articles. So, you could take or leave that. But then here's the back cover. And we have, this is a new copy from Columbia Games, if I'm not mistaken. Copyright 1997, which is a lot more recent than the original Gods of Harn from the 80s, which is a beautiful book was a beautiful book at the time, and it's a book I have enormous fondness for. But this is the much more recent presentation of the same material, pretty much. There is actually a Harn calendar, which you can download, I want to say for free, either off of Drive-Thru-RPG or from Columbia Games directly. And it has the holy days marked of all the temples and stuff, so that's neat to look at. So if you'd like to see more Harn content, please mention it in the comments below. If you have liked the video, please like the video. Please do subscribe to the channel and click the little bell icon to get notified when new content comes out. There are relatively few Harn content creators on YouTube, and I would like to do more with this setting as well. So again, thanks again for watching. Please do check out the links in the video description for the Patreon and the merch store, the Ardwulf Lair merch store. We'll see you next time. Thanks again for watching, and happy gaming.